than a historical fact. Now, there are a few antagonists. They point out the fact that there's no historical record of such a queen as Esther. They do have some of the queens named, but none of them are Esther, Hadassah, or anything similar. Nor is there a record of the decrees that were sent out, nor is there a record of a major massacre of over 75,000 people. So I've tried looking into the historical side as well. Obviously, I'm more of a keyboard hack than an archaeologist, but my overall consensus is that there's not enough evidence against it to dismiss it outright. If in the time of the kingdom that we find either this way or that, if it was or wasn't essential reading, I'll be glad to know the answer then. But for now, I'll say this. If it was just put together as a story, then it has been very thoroughly researched, because there's lots of historical accuracy that can be found in the book. So a couple of those things are things along the line of this. King Ahasuerus, he's generally regarded as being Xerxes. So the Xerxes is the Greek interpretation of his name, and that king lived in Persia from about 486 to 465 BC. And the biblical portrayal of Ahasuerus being impulsive, proud, very quick to anger, very extravagant, this matches how ancient Greek historians like Herodotus described Xerxes I. So that's well in its favour. Also, the archaeology and the layout of the palace at Shushan is important. I know it's a bit of a mishmash of pictures, but the archaeological excavations at Shushan reveal that the author of Esther knew the palace's layout very intimately. So the text accurately describes things like the inner court, the outer court, the throne room, and the king's gate. So, for example, Esther 5 verse 1 states that Esther stood in the inner court opposite the king's hall, and archaeological blueprints show that anyone standing in the inner court had a direct line of sight to the throne room, exactly as described. So you can actually see that from this side. This is the actual site. That's an artist's impression of what it looked like, and this is a top view of where it is. So when we read about Mordecai being at the gate, that's the gate down there. It talks about the outer courtyard, which is where Haman was waiting to speak to the king. So they had an outer courtyard. It had a banquet hall up this end, which is well known. There's actually little bits of it left in the Louvre. So there's 36 pillars, and they had these little bull ornaments sitting on the top of each of the pillars that were up there. So that was in that extravagant area out here, and that was known for where he hosted their drinking parties, which they were quite famous for. And the artwork around the building was meant to be quite incredible. These are some of the work that was done on the walls that's been removed and taken to other places. And this is where they're talking about how in the outer court you could see all the way to the king's throne room, and 3 is where Esther and the other concubines would have been housed. So the archaeology of the event was actually very well recorded, and so that does point very well towards an accurate portrayal. There's also some other things in there which are regarding the Persian customs and names and various administrative details. So some of the names mentioned in Esther have been found on ancient Persian cuneiform tablets as officials or treasury officers serving around the time of Xerxes. And some of the practices in Persia, such as the extravagant royal banquets, which were basically wine drinking feasts, the royal courier system to deliver the king's messages all around the country, the rules regarding the decree irrevocability, and the idea of throwing lots, the Purim, they're all verified by Persian history. So I guess that what I'm saying is that if it is just a story, it's a very, very well-researched one. So I can't guarantee its authenticity, but it has stood the test of time. And I feel that if God hadn't wanted it to be there, then there would have been many ways or opportunities that could have been there to have it removed. And yet here it is. So for tonight, we'll treat it as very real and a good way for us to look into different aspects of faith. So we're now going to look at some of the main characters to the story. Now, when you look at this, this is a chart showing just how many times each character is mentioned. And there's a few other characters specifically named, but these are the ones which have got more than 5 mentions out of all of them. The first thing you'll notice is that the king is grossly overrepresented. If you're quick at your math, you'll see that he's mentioned more times than the total of all the other main characters. So we're going to look at him first, but just because his name comes up most, it doesn't mean he's the most important character. Also, for the sake of tonight, I don't plan to look in detail at Vashti. Her part in the story is one of pride and defiance. It doesn't really fit that well with our topic of faith, and we don't really quite have enough time to cover that. Instead, we'll start by looking at the king. Now, I've seen and heard a number of times when the king is used as a type of representative of God or Christ. But I have to say that I don't really hold to that. I think people try and do this because of the many parables of Christ, where the king or a ruler is used in that way. But this story, I don't think should be treated that way. I think that if we try and do that, it's like trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole, hoping that with much hammering we'll shear the corners off to make it fit. While he's presented as a king, he doesn't really show any of the qualities of what I would call a good king, nor that of being a good husband. Now, we know the Bible shows marriage as being a respectful and loving mutual arrangement. And from the moment when God brings Adam and Eve together, right up until the fulfilment of the type with God presenting the bride to Christ in the kingdom, we see this picture of marriage all the way through. By contrast, we see here a king who first of all tries to show off his first wife Vashti as some kind of trophy, and then he throws a tantrum when she refuses to come. He then publicly issues a decree saying that men are to be the master in their own house. Now, in a healthy relationship, this respect should actually just be earned rather than demanded. And just as we show respect to Christ because of what he's done for us, it's the same way as a marriage between a husband and wife. If you have to make a law about it, it only really highlights the obvious lack of respect that must have been there, and making it a law certainly didn't fix the problem. So the next thing that this man does is he rounds up every good-looking woman in the area in order to populate his harem and essentially surround himself with good-looking concubines. And even when he's chosen the best one, we read she is in fear of her life if she goes to him without his blessing. So this is not a good representation of a stable figure as either a king or a husband. So instead, King Ahasuerus serves as a form of unsettling contrast to the good characters of Esther and Mordecai. In the story, Esther and Mordecai portray conviction, self-sacrifice, and quiet trust in divine providence, whereas Ahasuerus embodies earthly power without any form of spiritual grounding. He's shown as a ruler who is somewhat controlled by ego, by indulgence, a lot of drunkenness, which is recorded all the way through, and he's a person who's at the sway of whoever is immediately advising him. So I'll show a few things to back this up. So there's a few key characteristics that we're going to look at with King Ahasuerus. We won't be turning up all the quotes, but I've got them there. He's recorded as being quite self-indulgent and ostentatious. So the narrative opens with him throwing a 180-day feast purely to show off his wealth and royal majesty. It shows this life centred on luxury, banquets, and comfort. He was shown through the record to be impulsive and quite emotionally volatile. He operates on immediate emotional reactions. He banishes Queen Vashti in a fit of alcohol-fueled anger. He agrees to a genocide decree while drinking with Haman, and he orders Haman's execution in a sudden rage as well. So he's very quick to make these decisions depending on what's happening around him. He's also shown as being rather passive and quite easily manipulated. So despite wielding absolute authority over 127 provinces, he delegates his power somewhat carelessly. He passes his signet ring straight to Haman, without really asking too many basic questions about this group of people he's trying to wipe out. And then later on, he just as easily hands it over to Mordecai. So it basically acts as a rubber stamp for whoever the counsellor is that's currently holding his ear. And the other thing about him, he's quite legalistic, but he's also shown as being somewhat unprincipled. He relies heavily on the legal precedent and the imperial law to manage his personal life, yet he lacks the personal moral compass necessary to distinguish true justice from self-serving manipulation. So then, as a contrast, we're going to look at Queen Esther. Now, Queen Esther is one of the Bible's most dramatic narratives of the story. She's recorded as being a very beautiful person, but not just in her external physical appearance, but more importantly, in the way she conducted herself and the way that she was with those around her. We're first introduced to Esther by her Hebrew name of Hadassah in Esther 2 verse 7. She's recorded there as an orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai. Here she's recorded as being a young woman, lovely and beautiful. She's likely to have been aged somewhere between 15 to 20 at the time, and the specific Hebrew word used in verse 7 for young woman supports this assumption. Her beauty obviously caught the eye of the king's servants in verse 8, and she was taken to be part of the king's rather dubious plan to solve his problem with his previous wife Vashti. It isn't clear, though, if Esther had much of a choice in the matter. I always seem to understand that she had herself chosen to be a part of the king's beauty pageant, but the more I look at it, the more I feel she was somewhat forced into the arrangement without much say in the matter. But we also know that when she found herself in that terrible situation, she didn't let it break her. Rather, she was able to make things work right out into the end. But it wasn't just her physical attractiveness that made her beautiful. She obviously had a lovely personality and was good around other people. She quickly gained the favour of the head eunuch, and we can only assume that he wasn't likely to be swayed by pure physical beauty alone. There's other indications in the story to show that it wasn't just her physical appearance that counted. She seemed to be liked and admired by all those who were around her. And even the king, in choosing her, indicated that he was attracted to something in her other than just her good looks alone. It's likely that the king had married Vashti for her beauty alone without looking for any underlying character, and it appears that he didn't want to make the same mistake twice. So when placed into the royal court of the Persian king, she transformed from a vulnerable Jewish orphan into a decisive queen who later rescued her entire nation from what was essentially state-sanctioned genocide. She would likely have been in her early to mid-30s, when she successfully foiled Haman's plot about a decade after the initial marriage. And what makes the story remarkable is her personal evolution. So she moves from self-preservation to self-sacrifice. She grounds her courage in spiritual discipline and wisdom. So there's a few key characteristics of Queen Esther, that being of humility and a teachable spirit. So even after being crowned Queen of Persia, she continued to seek and honour the counsel of her older cousin and guardian Mordecai. She had poise and diplomacy, and she was able to navigate the treacherous male-dominated politics of the Persian court with quite a degree of grace, organising her banquets that were used to help sway the king. And she used her influence effectively without compromising her integrity. She also showed courage under pressure. By approaching the Persian king uninvited, she could have received the death penalty automatically. And so she chose to risk her life for her people, famously saying, "If I perish, I perish." She also showed a lot of wisdom and patience. So rather than acting on raw emotion or blurting out accusations against Haman when there was trouble, she instead calculated and executed a quite strong multi-stage strategy, hosting 2 private banquets for the king and Haman, and carefully building rapport and choosing the exact right moment to reveal the plot. Next, we're going to look at Mordecai. Mordecai is a central figure in the book of Esther, and while Esther represents youth and beauty, Mordecai represents age and wisdom. He was from the tribe of Benjamin and served as Esther's adoptive father after her parents died. He started as a minor official in the Persian court at Shushan and eventually became the Grand Vizier of Persia following Haman's fall. He was likely to be middle-aged, but there's been confusion about his age due to some translational errors. In Esther 2, some translations such as the New King James Version has this for the verse 5. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. And then in verse 6, Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives. Now, in other translations, the start of verse 6 just said, he was carried away captive. And so from that, people assumed that it meant Mordecai. But if that was the case, he would likely be somewhere over 120 years old, which would also then make Esther, being his cousin, quite a lot older as well. So it doesn't really work that way, and the translation saying that Kish had been carried away, so his grandfather was carried away captive, would then make a lot more sense to set his age to be somewhat middle-aged, but not as old as 120. So what were some of the characteristics of Mordecai? He was shown to be a devoted caregiver. When Esther's parents died, Mordecai raised his younger cousin like his own daughter. And even after she was taken to the king's harem, he walked daily near to the courtyard to be able to check on her welfare. He was also known as a loyal civic servant. He demonstrated his civic integrity by uncovering an assassination plot by some of the royal guards against King Ahasuerus. He reported it to save the king's life, but he obviously didn't at that time demand any recognition or reward for that. He also had uncompromising convictions, so when King Ahasuerus had commanded everyone to bow down to Haman, Mordecai flatly refused. And as a devout Jew, he reserved worship for God alone and stood firm despite severe peer pressure and even mortal threat. He was also shown to be a very strategic mentor and a good, wise leader. He understood political systems and strategic communication. He guided Esther on when to keep her identity hidden and when to reveal it, and also how to challenge the genocide decree legally later on. Now, the next person we're going to look at is Haman. And this one's actually got the audio files still there because it's very good. Every good story needs a baddie, and Haman is one of the worst. He was the Prime Minister of King Ahasuerus in the book of Esther and serves as the primary antagonist of the narrative. He was a Grand Vizier defined by extreme pride, malice, and a deep-seated desire for gratuitous recognition. He's referred to as an Agagite, and so he wasn't a Persian, but rather of Amalekite descent. The Amalekites are well known as being a thorn in the side of Israel since the time of the wilderness wanderings, where they were infamous for attacking the weak and the stragglers. I said earlier there weren't really any references to Esther through the Bible, but here we see a link somewhat the other direction. He's directly referred to as an Agagite, which puts him as a direct descendant of King Agag, also who was from the time of Saul. So what's interesting about that is King Saul's father was also Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin. So this draws a very obvious parallel between Mordecai and what King Saul failed to do by not killing King Agag many years ago. I think this is a very deliberate mention of the genealogy, as well as painting a likely reason as to why Haman hated the Jews so much. So what else do we know of his main characteristics? We read of his ego and megalomania. He was driven by an insatiable need for public praise. He raged at Mordecai because he refused to bow down to him, and this stems from obviously an inflated sense of self-importance that demanded absolute submission. You also see in the story his genocidal malice. He was highly vindictive and disproportionate in his vengeance. Rather than just wanting to punish Mordecai individually, his hatred extends to the total extermination of the entire Jewish population, women and children. He shows manipulative opportunism. He was a skilled political operator who leveraged King Ahasuerus' lack of guidance. He frames his hatred as concern for national security, and he claimed that the Jews followed laws different from all other people while offering a massive bribe to the royal treasury. Another thing we read about is his superstitious reliance. So he relied on the pure, the lot, to determine the best date for the massacre that he was planning. So he trusted in fate, astrology, or pagan divination to validate his plans. We also read of his blind arrogance. So he had a fatal lack of self-awareness, and this is shown when King Ahasuerus asked how to honour the man that the king favours. And so Haman automatically assumed that the king meant him, and in so doing he unwittingly designs a public parade for his sworn enemy Mordecai. But we also see of him cowardice when under fire. When he had power, he was bold and ruthless, but immediately after he realises his life's on the line with Queen Esther, he begs her for his life when his plot is exposed and the king's favour has shifted. So those are the main characters and their background and characteristics. But as a recap, and in order to outline the story for us all, I'd like to show a quick video overview of the Bible as presented by the Bible Project. Now, these are not Christadelphians, but they are very good Bible students and can do a much better job of summarising the book in a way that helps us to remember than I think I could do. I've found their work to be excellent with very few deviances from literal Bible interpretation, and I'd like to credit and acknowledge their work.
The book of Esther. It's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. The main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther is going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep. And he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading. And he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution. And the king, in that moment, orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now, this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that, first of all, she's Jewish, and second, that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now, the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end, they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center, you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's two banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story: Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story is not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral examples, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we began: why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history. And he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
As you can see, it's a very good little summary of the entire book, and brought out a few things which I hadn't noticed before, with the almost charismatic mirroring either side. There's a few more things which I couldn't fit in for time as well, but I enjoy their work. Now, one of the things they mentioned at the end was, where is God in the book of Esther? I'll just let you know, the Jews give their answer from Deuteronomy. If we could turn to Deuteronomy 31, we're going to look at verses 16 to 18. So the Jews never forgot how it was idolatry that brought about the downfall of the Jewish kingdom. And when the people were taken into captivity of Babylon and Persia, so Deuteronomy 31, midway through verse 16, we read, "This people will rise and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land where they go to be among them, and they will forsake me and break my covenant which I've made with them. Then my anger shall be aroused against them to that day, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them, that they shall be devoured. And many evils and troubles shall befall them, and they will say that day, have not these evils come upon us, because God is not among us? And I will surely hide my face in that day, because of all the evil which they have done, in that they have turned to other gods." So from these verses they say that even though the face of God is not openly shown in the book of Esther, his hidden hand is seen in the events that occur in order to bring about the preservation of his people, making sure that ultimately his will is done. And there are many incredible coincidences in the book. Esther finding favour with those in the household, Mordecai uncovering the assassination plot, the king having his sleepless night just before Haman came in to get Mordecai killed, and there's many other coincidences. But also these characters exhibit faith not just because they saw miraculous signs or heard direct voices from heaven. This is the thing about the book of Esther. They did these things because they trusted that God was working behind the scenes, even when he seemed to be completely silent. And we can draw parallels to that today. While we have the Bible to learn from, we don't claim any specific divine intervention in our lives, at least not yet anyway. We only look to, again, see God's hidden hand at work in our lives, and that is certainly there if we make an effort to look for it. And just like in the time of Esther, there are people around today who hate the Jews and would do anything they could to destroy them. We know this will be the way of the world right up until the time when our Lord Jesus Christ will return to save God's people from annihilation. But our theme tonight is looking at faith in the book of Esther, so I'd like us to turn to our reading from tonight so we can look at all four of our main characters and see how their faith was driven. Now, in contrast to Esther and Mordecai, King Ahasuerus and Haman represent living by self-reliance, pride and earthly power rather than by faith. They serve as a literary and moral comparison to the heroes, and they illustrate what happens when human ego replaces devotion to God. So we'll start with the king. We'll look at Esther chapter 3 and verses 8 to 11 and verse 15. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among all the people in the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other people's. They do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it's not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it to the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring, gave it to Haman, who was the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money and the people are given to you. Do with them as this seems good to you." Then to verse 15, couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and it was proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. So in the case of the king, his faith was in the direction of whoever was flattering him at the time. And even though they were blatantly discussing genocide, he had no qualms with that. So in the end, he was happy to frivolously spend his money and then just wanted to get to another drink with his buddies. So the direct contrast is showing Ahasuerus versus Esther and Mordecai, where the king was very happy to have his human title, whereas Esther and Mordecai had their basis was based on faith and moral conviction and divine providence. When it came to decision making, the king seemed to be driven by pride, alcohol, and emotional impulse, whereas with Esther and Mordecai, there's wisdom, fasting, and prayer. When it comes to the use of power, the king was happy to pretty well do anything he was told from other people, and it didn't matter if he was sacrificing his own citizens, whereas Esther and Mordecai were sacrificial, willing to risk their own lives for the sake of others. And with the king, while he appeared to be in control, he was basically a puppet to whoever was talking to him at the time. Whereas the contrast is with Esther and Mordecai, they seemed to be powerless, yet they were the ones who were actually shaping history. So for Haman, the verses which we read from tonight that sum up his faith or lack of it come from Esther 3 verse 5 to 7, where we read about Mordecai not bowing or paying homage to Haman, so he was filled with wrath, and he didn't want to just lay hands on Mordecai alone, but he wanted to also destroy the people of Mordecai as well. So verse 7, in the first month, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month, until it fell on the 12th month in the month of Adar. So Haman put his faith in the wrong things. He put his faith in pride and luck. So Haman represents the folly of self-worship, which becomes the ultimate rejection of faith if we only focus on self. Instead of submitting to higher authority, he demanded worship for himself and allowed personal offence to consume his judgment, which basically brought about his downfall. So in self-exaltation, Haman's identity was tied to his status. He only wanted people to honour him, and when the king talked to him about someone who needed to be praised, he instantly assumed that the king was talking about him. But he had very fragile insecurity. Despite having immense power, wealth and favour, it doesn't seem to matter while Mordecai is refusing to bow down to him. He also resorted to superstition over any divine trust. So instead of seeking higher moral good, he relied on casting lots to determine his lucky day for salvation. And he placed his trust in luck, politics and violence. It's interesting that Proverbs 16 verse 33 says how the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. We know that pride is the enemy of faith, and when we make ourselves the centre of our universe, our peace becomes contingent on control and the approval of others. So we've got a number of contrasts which we have there between both Esther and Mordecai and also Ahasuerus and Haman. For time, I'll keep moving on. Mordecai, however, showed faith in providence and divine purpose. For a summary of Mordecai's faith from our reading tonight, we look at Esther 4 verse 1 and verses 13 and 14, where in verse 1 we read of how he tore his clothes open, let out a loud and bitter cry. He openly showed his grief before God and all those around him. And then in verse 13, Mordecai sent an answer to Esther saying, "Don't think in your heart you'll escape the king's palace, in the king's palace more than any other Jew." This is the important bit. "If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish." So he was putting his trust in God to deliver them all. It wasn't just about him or Esther, it was about God's people. And he shows his profound, unwavering trust in divine providence and in God's conventional faithfulness. He showed unwavering integrity when Haman demanded him to bow down. He stood firm on his convictions. He showed absolute confidence in God's covenant. When he's faced with Haman's decree of annihilation, he told Esther that relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise. So he was absolutely certain that God would not allow the Jewish nation to be erased. He showed the recognition of divine purpose. He possessed a faith that had a perspective that saw God's hand shaping circumstances for his specific high purpose. And also we can see his public humility and mourning. His faith was grounded in genuine spiritual repentance and with corporate solidarity with his people. He really wanted to show how sad he was for God's people. And for Esther, the verses from our reading that summarise her faith are found in Esther 4 verse 15 and 16, where she told Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, fast for me, neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, so I'll go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." She knew the risks, but she was prepared to take them for the sake of her people, and that was her faith shining through. So in Esther, we see her trusting this unseen God. She expressed faith through her spiritual discipline. Before going before the king, she didn't just go, "Oh, he's going to like me for my good looks," but rather she also chose to look to God to help her in this way. She called for this unified 3-day fast among all the Jews, but she also fasted for that time. She didn't just ask other people to do that. She did that herself as well. She also was quite involved in looking towards the divine purpose. She recognised her privilege was a responsibility. She was the queen, but she realised that God had given her purpose, which was larger than her own comfort. She also lived in the period of exile where visible miracles like the parting of the Red Sea or fire from heaven were absent, and so her faith meant trusting that God was working behind the scenes for their salvation. And we know the outcome of faith for Esther and Mordecai, and through their faith and careful planning, Haman was removed and replaced by Mordecai, but that still left problems with the initial decree that had gone out. Fortunately, they did have about 8 or 9 months to go until the time when they were going to be attacked, so they were able to make a new decree to put out and say that the Jews were able to group together and defend themselves against any who chose to attack them. Now on this, I would like to just clear up an issue that arises from the record of this event. We hear a lot about genocide these days, particularly it's used against the Jews and what they're doing against the Palestinians. I have to say I'm not comfortable with the reported attacks on the Palestinians these days, but I find it very uncomfortable when the Jews are accused of genocide, particularly when many people overlook the fact that a lot of the terrorist organisations that the Jews are fighting specifically state that they want to annihilate the Jewish race, but then people don't seem to look at that. And there's that same level with some of the accusations of genocide against the Jews in the record of Esther as well, saying that the Jews are trying to kill everyone, women and children. And once again in this, the odd thing is that in Haman's original plan, he specifically said that he wanted to destroy all of them, women and children, but people overlook that as well. But I'll put it to you, it wasn't in Esther's plan to kill women and children. Rather, this is a translational error. So when you read some translations, they're not very clear, and that's why people get worried about the genocide. In the AV, it does say at the end that to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of the prey. And that does look quite damning that way, but other translations now show that it's not saying that the Jews wanted to kill all women and children, but rather, like the NIV, that they were to kill all those who would attack the Jewish women and children. And there's a number of other translations that put it that way, that it's when people were trying to attack them, their women and children, then they would respond and destroy them, not that they were going to go out and kill all the women and children. And now, through what's happened with the work of Esther, Esther is remembered every year by Jewish people, celebrating deliverance of her people from their enemies through the Feast of Purim. But it's not just that way that she's remembered. For example, in Israel, they have a way to create a memorial to the saving work of Esther through the naming of the famous Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. Now, regarding the Purim, it is getting a little late, but I will play this, but I might cut it a little bit short towards the end. This gives an introduction to what is done in Jewish households now for Purim.
What is Purim, and why do Jewish people celebrate it? Purim is one of the most festive celebrations, and it has a special place in the yearly cycle of Jewish religious life. Purim commemorates the events in the book of Esther, and the word Purim, meaning lots, is derived from Esther 3:7, where lots were cast for selecting the day and month to annihilate all the Jewish people throughout the entire Persian Empire. In this story, we are introduced to some of the most colorful characters in the Bible. We meet our heroes, the beautiful Queen Esther and her cousin Mordecai, whom God used to save the Jewish people from the hands of the cruel antagonist Haman, a royal official of the Persian king. Haman had plotted to destroy the Jewish people through legal means. Haman is identified as an Agite in Esther 3:1, a descendant of the Amalekites whose history of enmity with Israel traces all the way back to the time of Moses, when the Amalekites opposed the children of Israel. From that day forward, Amalekites have been Israel's foe from generation to generation, Exodus 17:16. While the ethnic identity of the Amalekites has been lost from history beyond the Bible, the spirit of Amalek is very much alive in the same blind hatred that drove Haman. Throughout the generations, tradition has identified the Amalekite spirit with the anti-Semitic powers that have sought to destroy the Jewish people even to this day. But as the biblical story recounts, Haman's plan was prevented through the bravery of Queen Esther and the wisdom of Mordecai. Mordecai urged her to approach the king, and even at the risk of death, and expose Haman's wicked plot. In a climactic turn of events, the Jewish people are delivered, while Haman and his household are allotted the destruction he intended for God's people. Purim is celebrated as a remembrance of God's preservation of his people, and he has been doing so time and time again. Here are 5 traditions Jewish people observe during Purim. Number 1, the reading of the Megillah, or the Scroll of Esther, is read publicly and aloud at a synagogue service. Now, if you're imagining a solemn and tedious reading, guess again. The atmosphere of Purim is filled with fun costumes, engaging interaction, and of course, yummy treats. Often, the story is recited through dramatic enactments called Purim spiels. During the service, children and adults hold noisemakers called groggers, and whenever the name Haman is mentioned, they make as much noise as possible and shout "boo" to blot out his name and memory. Similarly, when Esther's name is read, shouts of "yay" fill the room. Reading the story of Esther interactively not only helps listeners remember the story and God's faithfulness, but it also inspires faith and courage to stand against injustice and Jewish hate. Number 2, Jewish communities around the world eat a special holiday meal in celebration of God's deliverance in the book of Esther. This meal is called the Suda, which is the Hebrew word for a festive meal or banquet. After Haman's defeat, an edict went out allowing the Jewish people to defend and rid themselves of their enemies. This act was done on the 13th day of Adar, where 75,000 of their enemies were killed. Afterwards, the Jewish people celebrated their survival and victory with a day of feasting. Hence that popular Jewish saying, "They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat." Number 3. Have you ever wondered why Jewish communities around the world dress up during Purim? Here are 2 reasons. One of them is to symbolize Esther's hidden identity. Esther had initially concealed her Jewish identity in front of King Ahasuerus, so dressing up mirrors her initial hidden identity. The second reason is the idea of hidden miracles. While God isn't overtly mentioned in the book of Esther, we see his miraculous salvation disguised in natural events through his chosen vessels, Queen Esther and Mordecai. Number 4, eating triangular-shaped cookies called Hamantaschen. There are many symbolic meanings behind Hamantaschen. One of the most common is that the cookie's 3 corners represent Haman's 3-cornered hat, and eating them symbolizes the destruction of his power. These delicious pastries originated in Germany during the 18th century. The pastry is made of flour, butter, and sugar, and there's traditionally a poppy seed filling in them. Modern-day Hamantaschen are filled with other fillings like apricot, strawberry, blueberry jams, and even chocolate. Number 5, Tanit Esther. This is the fast of Esther, which is a Jewish fast observed a day before Purim. The fast is usually only done by more religious Orthodox Jewish people. It commemorates the fast that Queen Esther undertook for 3 days before approaching the king. Many Jewish people fast from dawn to dusk on the eve of Purim. We read Esther's words to Mordecai. "Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish." Esther 4:16. Tanit Esther commemorates the courage Esther had in risking her life for her people. This fast opens a wonderful opportunity to share the gospel with Jewish people because Esther's sacrificial intercession is thoroughly messianic. It foreshadows and frames Jesus' own story and his royal calling. In fact, there are many striking parallels between Esther and Jesus. The first similarity is, in the last hour, both Esther and Jesus wrestle with the troubling threat of death, seek the Lord, and request the support of others. As Esther invited Jewish people to fast with her just before going to the king at the risk of death, so Jesus invited his disciples to keep watch with him in the Garden of Gethsemane just before going to the Sanhedrin at the risk or guarantee of death. Secondly, Esther and Jesus share a courageous willingness to die for the salvation of their people out of profound love and submission to God's will. Finally, Esther and Jesus are both mediators interceding between life and death for their people, and their intercession succeeds in changing or canceling the edict that stood against God's people, condemning them to death. It was the hidden presence and spirit of Yeshua that moved in the book of Esther and within Esther herself, who foreshadowed the messianic path of selfless sacrifice in order to save God's people from a far greater death and a far more malicious Haman. While Purim is a fun, carnival-like celebration, it has a prophetic significance. Purim reminds us that there is a real spirit of anti-Semitism that has sought to annihilate the Jewish people for thousands of years. But ultimately, God's divine protection will always fight to preserve his chosen people. In this, we know that God's love and faithfulness will never end. And this is true for all followers of Messiah. While we celebrate a great deliverance and defeat of evil at Purim, the holiday points to an even greater salvation and victory over the evil forces through God's chosen royal priest Yeshua, who always lives to make intercession. Hebrews 7:25. This Purim, let us rejoice in God's faithfulness and continue to pray for our Jewish friends and family. Chag Sameach, Happy Purim.
So again, that's not a Christadelphian group, but it gave some good information. As an interesting thing for the reading tonight, I was wondering if I could find some of those little groggers to spin around, but while Colin was reading, every time we read Haman's name, but couldn't find them, and it might have been a little bit disruptive as well, so we'll save that for another time. So for each of us, our faith is what drives us. It's what makes us do the things we do when we're faced with a choice. So how are we going to use the example from Esther to show our own personal faith? Well, Esther began the story as a passive, hidden figure almost, but as her faith matured into what it was toward the end, it was more bold and active. When faced with the destruction of her people, she stepped out of her comfort zone and risked her life by approaching the king uninvited and surrendered her personal safety for the greater good. So we know that real faith isn't just the absence of fear, but it's choosing to act courageously on behalf of others despite our fears. Mordecai showed steadfast conviction in God's promises and sovereignty. He refused to bow to Haman because of his commitment to God, and he maintained absolute confidence that God would deliver his people, regardless of how bleak the circumstances appeared. And likewise, faith sees beyond immediate circumstances and trusts that God is working behind the scenes, placing us deliberately where we are needed the most. So both Esther and Mordecai showed faith not because they saw miraculous signs or heard direct voices from heaven, but rather because they trusted that God was working behind the scenes, even when he seemed completely silent. So may this be the lesson that we take away tonight when we consider the faith of Esther and Mordecai.
Thanks, Dave, for bringing the story and the characters of Esther to life and showing us some of their inner motivations and characteristics of all the characters. We'll take a little break from our Men and Women of Faith topic for a few weeks. Next week's class will be Craig Farron talking on the topic Haggai, Consider Your Ways. Coming up on Sunday, we have Brother Adrian Farron to exhort and Hospitality Sunday, so no meeting here, but a chance to come together and to invite people around and spend some time together. That is not... It has been changed? Okay.
So Sunday afternoon we have Alan Wyatt became a Christadelphian with Kia and...
Well, that sounds fabulous. We'll look forward to that. So how and why I became a Christadelphian with Keir and who? Eldon. Oh, lovely. All right, that'll be great. So that is for the afternoon there. So to conclude, we'll have a song based on Psalm 20, which will be followed by prayer. If you'll all rise.
Lord, answer our prayers. Then you will win the victory, and we will shout for joy, lifting our banners in the name of our God. Give the King the victory, Lord, answer our prayers. Lord, answer our prayers.
Our great God, we pray to you now as one who listens, as one who does indeed answer prayers. We've thought tonight about how those prayers were answered for Mordecai, for Esther, for all your people. And we know in our lives that sometimes it's hard to see those prayers answered. We don't explicitly see everything you do, just like in the book of Esther, but that your hand is always there. Your hand is always supporting us. And sometimes it's weeks, months, years later that we see it, but Father, we know that it is working in our lives. Help us all to realise that. Help us all to live in your ways, to trust in you. And please bring your kingdom soon. We pray this all through Jesus' name. Amen.